then in '79, I started doing research on Anderson, and I couldn't believe that he was not listed as an artist. And so I have set about correcting that.
Good for you.
And my motive, there's no other way I could see this many of his works. I had to get this done because I couldn't go in a private home and do them and see them, but then if by arranging this, here are 50 of them.
When we started looking for Anderson, we really didn't have much to go on. I was concerned, I think, in the beginning that we didn't have very much information about the man. We collected a number of his paintings, but we had no feeling for who he was. He was still a mystery. We knew, we had a few facts about when he was born and where he grew up and so on and so forth, but no real feeling about him. We have none of the traditional documents that you might use to flesh out a person who also is an artist, try to find out why he paints what he paints, where he comes from in terms of his style, his subject matter, his approach to it, things like this. One would normally have things like diaries, letters, recollections from friends, various things like this, and we didn't have almost any of those kinds of traditional documents. So what we had to do is start from the paintings in and try to find out as much as we could about every subject that was in each painting, try to locate the places that they take place, where the scenes take place, any data that we could about a particular riverboat that was portrayed, and out of that we began to find some correlations that were very interesting.
His pictures kind of grow on you. The more you see them, the more you like them, and it was just kind of a natural growth, or a natural increase in interest, and then I began to explore other documents and things in the family, and I found that I had Julia, his sister, Julia Lawrence, Harris's Bible, and she had very carefully made notes on her brother, and I just went from there, and I got all the information that was available in this area, and then I realized that he had done most of his work in Memphis, and I went to Memphis, to the Memphis room, and found that they had a folder on him, and I gained a great deal of information from that source. One of the paintings that he did is of we call it the log house, and cousin Nora was a Harris who happened to was married to Captain Hensley, and they built the log house in the 1870s, and that is one of the paintings that Fred did. Now undoubtedly he visited in this house. It's quite entirely possible as one of his aunts lived there until her death in about the 1930s, I'm sorry. And so it's entirely possible that he was very familiar with that house.
Did you live there?
I lived there from 1954, I'm in the wrong century, 1954 until we built this house in 66, I believe it was. And it's an interesting old house. And I kind of moved into it as was, so I got to explore a lot of and investigate a lot of records, the type things that people leave behind.
Hilda Adams had a collection of articles that she'd gotten from the Memphis room at the Memphis Public Library, and among these articles was one about the show that was held at the Brooks Gallery in Memphis in 1945. Listed in this article was a list of names of people they had borrowed works from for the exhibition there. and among those were names of people in Memphis that we thought we'd be able to get in touch with. So, two of the particular names on that list, one was a Mrs. Selden Humphreys, who was listed as the granddaughter of Anderson. The other one was the name Sims, S-E-M-M-E-S. So I went to the Memphis phone book, and there were just pages of Humphreys, but there were only 7 Sims. So I started with the Sims, thought that would be easier. And after several calls, I found a lady in Memphis who said that she had a cousin in New York named Sims that she thought had an Anderson relative. So I called a lady named Sims, Shelby Sims, in New York, and she said, oh, yes, indeed, she did have some Anderson relatives. And she gave me the name of Harriet Anderson Stagey, who she thought might have some connection. So I called Harriet Anderson Stagey, and lo and behold, she was Anderson's granddaughter.
I often have wished that we had taken time to learn and know more about it. And so this exhibit means so much. I'm learning now so much more about Frederick T. Anderson than I ever really knew. So it's a treat. I wouldn't have missed this for anything.
He seems to be a very regional person, and I say that more than just his fame as an artist, but rather his interest was truly in the region he lived in, which places him very much, I think, in the context of many American artists who specialized in the area around them. He specialized in scenes along the Arkansas River, primarily in Jefferson County, and on the Memphis segment of the Mississippi River. He, almost all of his paintings have some kind of connection to that, one of those two subjects. The Sultana was a large packet boat, but it was fairly old, and it had loaded on released prisoners of war from, Union prisoners of war from Andersonville prison. At Vicksburg, it was overloaded, its boilers were strained, and it came upriver with 2,500 Union soldiers aboard. It docked at Memphis in the evening, and in about, we have a small painting by Anderson of that particular event. And then about 10 o'clock it left Memphis and started upriver for Ohio, and got about 3 miles upriver, and its boilers exploded. 1,500 soldiers died that night. That was the worst river disaster, certainly, in history. Walter Chandler was the mayor of Memphis and a patron and a friend, apparently, of Anderson. And he commissioned over a several-year period a group of Civil War naval battles along the Mississippi River. An example of that is there's paintings, for instance, a painting in the Chandler collection of the beginning of the Battle of Memphis, when the rebel or Confederate ship Little Rebel steamed upriver to meet the entire Union fleet, while the rest of the Confederate fleet at Memphis was able to take a little bit more time to weigh anchor and prepare for the battle. So we see that scene portrayed several times, including in the Chandler collection. Then we also see the battle at its very height in front of Memphis, in which most of the gunships of both fleets were at interchanging shots. We also see the beginning and the end of the Battle of Mobile Bay. We see several cases like that. We see the case where the Confederate ram Arkansas is being towed downriver right at the fall of the Battle of Memphis. She was built around Memphis and was not completed when Memphis fell to the Union forces. And she was towed downriver and completed downriver, and we see the picture first of her being towed downriver, and then we see a companion piece of her having been completed, leaving the mouth of the Yazoo River and attacking a Union fleet there, sinking one ship, sending two others into retreat.
This is the one that we were unable to find out until
The New Orleans.
This is the this was the New Orleans gathering the wood, taking in wood and you know, cutting the lumber down, and this was the location that you all came up with, and I didn't know where it was.
Right, it was,
It's not on the back, I don't
I
think.
think it's inside,
I think it is inside.
but it is.
This one is on the arrival of the first steamboat at New Orleans, January 11th, 1812. I thought that, for historic reasons, really was nice.
New Orleans was the first steam riverboat to come down the Mississippi River in fact, the Western Rivers, Western Waterways is now called, in about 1812. And we find at least a half a dozen paintings by Anderson of that particular event. And so that particular one seems to fascinate him throughout his career. Some of the paintings are very early in it, some are very late in his career. Another interesting one that we had a hard time discovering was the race between the Princess and the Eclipse. And the Eclipse was the flagship, if you will, of the New Orleans to Louisville packet run after the war. It was one of the largest and most elaborate, and fastest of the antebellum packet boats. And, but it was not particularly connected to Memphis. It had no particular connection that we could find to that part of the river until we discovered that it was damaged in a storm in New Orleans, and it was bought by a Memphis firm and towed upstream to Memphis, where the decks were stripped off of this magnificent showboat, packet boat, and it spent the rest of its life as a floating wharf until it sank off the Memphis waterfront. So there's some direct kind of connection, even in a situation like this. Another interesting painting that we had a little bit of a problem with was the sinking of the Confederate blockade runner, the Alabama, off the coast of France. It's an interesting painting in that it's historically it's a painting of the only Civil War battle in Europe, or at least close to Europe, but it has no real counterpart to any other of the paintings that Anderson did that we know of. It's an ocean scene. It's a battle that didn't seem to have any connection to the river, to Memphis, until we discovered that Captain Raphael Sims, who was the captain of the Alabama, was an ancestor of Anderson's wife's family. So that brought the connection again right back home again. And we begin to see Anderson developing out of these kinds of things as a person whose subjects were tied to his own personal experiences in some ways. And in some ways they were very arcane experiences. They were very involuted connections that he would have. But nevertheless, the connections seem to always be there in some form. So we see him emerging as a man who was fairly well known at the time that he was working. His work seems to have been snapped up pretty quickly by individuals and went into people's houses where most of these paintings have remained since they've been collected. A few have appeared in museums in the last few years when they were donated out of estates and so on. Often they're under misattributions, wrong names. Most museums simply didn't have any information about Anderson. And so we've been developing that kind of information. At the same time, we're kind of developing this business of the connections the paintings have, the historical value the paintings themselves have for this part of the country.
One of the most exciting finds, there was an article that we had gotten that said that Anderson had been commissioned by his friend Walter Chandler, then mayor of Memphis, to paint a scene commemorating Teddy Roosevelt's arrival in Memphis for the Waterways Convention of 1908. Roosevelt expressed his delight with the picture and said that he would really love to have a painting of another scene by the same artist. So nothing would do. Anderson, according to the article, Anderson painted another painting and sent it to the president. So I called the White House, and she suggested that I contact Sagamore Hill, which is the historic home of Teddy Roosevelt in Oyster Bay, New York. Well, I called Sagamore Hill, and they said they weren't sure they would check and call me back. And the curator there did call me back and said, why, yes, we have the two paintings you're talking about. And as a matter of fact, they're hanging over the bureau in Teddy's bedroom.
My grandfather had written to President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, and so they evidently had something in common. Maybe it was his paintings. But Teddy Roosevelt invited my grandfather to go to his Long Island home and visit there. And he was kind of elderly at the time, and my mother didn't feel like letting him go all by himself, so she sent me. And so I enjoyed the trip across Long Island Sound on a ferry boat. And then we got to the house, and I remember this great big room with all these heads of wild animals all hanging on the wall. After my first husband died, I don't know where I got this notion, but it must have stuck in my head someplace. I just picked up my family and moved to Paris for a year. I put the children in school, and then whenever we'd have a vacation, we'd take a trip someplace. I think I must have remembered that that's what my grandfather did, took my father to Paris to live.
We know that he went to Paris in about 1890, and it's reputed through the family that he studied in the studio of the French Impressionist painter Camille Pissarro. We don't have any firm document on that. We don't have any way of really checking that. However, it seems evident from the works themselves that if he didn't study necessarily in Pissarro's studio, or possibly with a Pissarro follower, or very probably with the various people around the Pissarro school, the Impressionist school at the period, this seems to be pretty evident from a number of his works, especially the landscapes that we find that deal with scenes around Arkansas. There's a strong stylistic connection that pervades those. It's very much a kind of neo-impressionist technique. His other works, however, are interesting in that they don't really maintain that. They're much closer in feeling and in style to British and American watercolorists. So we have these two kinds of paintings in his work, two almost different ways of approaching the subject matter. And then throughout most of his career, he was painting riverboats, and he was painting them in something more of a traditional American style of painting. Most of the paintings were really never exhibited. They were simply bought and taken into homes, and there's where they've remained for ever since they were painted. Many of the paintings in our show, for instance, have never been seen since publicly since they were painted. And then when he retired, quit painting, quit actively painting. Mention of him as an artist, mention of his work simply ceases to be, and it's almost as if he quit being an artist. Part of this is probably due to the fact that European
painting was coming into modern European painting. Picasso, Matisse, artists like this were showing up in the United States, and this was really taking over a new world of painting. And Anderson was a man who really lived in the 19th century and never quite made that transition, I think, to the 20th century. So we're talking about a man who's really, in a sense, out of time. He's a man who's painting a world that he remembers, paints this almost all of his life. Well, there's some paintings, of course, where he does paint scenes that he would have seen, famous boats on the river, the Pat Cleburne and the J.N. Harbin on the Arkansas River. But some of the most elegant of the paintings are of the great packet boats that were gone by this time. We have several problems still remaining. We have a number of missing paintings. Again, we expect that they're in private individuals' hands. We have paintings that he painted in Europe. We have descriptions of works that were done in the Alps, northern France, in Wales, we've never seen. We have descriptions of a couple of famous riverboat races that we've not seen. So there are paintings still out there. We think that there's maybe a great number of works still in existence that we have not located yet. And so we'll continue to move on that kind of interest and continue to refine our ability to look at his work in terms of the man, in terms of his motivations.